just want to say, first of all, it's super cool to see people even thinking about blockchain, because even just 2 years ago when I was in your shoes, nobody was at Penn. So that's cool.
Yeah,
Let's change.
it's great. I guess Sophia, Nathaniel, David, if you guys want to do a quick introduction, maybe start with Nathaniel. He's been looking mostly into Skip, so go ahead.
Cool.
Yeah, so I'm a third year at Penn studying data analytics. Last semester I looked into MEV auctions and looked at Skip as a case study actually. So definitely have some questions on that. And now I'm working group of people for our Flashbots MEV grant. Yeah.
Nice. Cool. Nice to meet you.
David?
Yeah, I can go next. I'm David. I just started my PhD, or I guess wrapping up the first year. Been basically just focusing on a lot of blockchain stuff. Still don't really know how to wrap it all together, but MEV is one of the things I've been interested in. But yeah, I worked for like 4 years before this in Robinhood and then some Web3 stuff. So kind of know my way around some stuff, but yeah.
I think David was your year, by the way.
Oh, nice. Cool.
Oh yeah, I graduated from Penn in 2018.
Oh, that was not my year. I was 2021.
Oh,
okay, yeah. Well, a while back, I guess.
Sophia, you want to introduce yourself, and Brandon? Sorry, lots of people.
Yeah, sure. Really quickly. So I'm one of the presidents of Penn Blockchain and FranklinDAO, but I'm just helping out on this research project because really interested in Flashbots, have some experience with MEV and like past experience mostly with trading and market making. So excited to hear your thoughts a little bit.
Cool.
Brandon?
I'm Brandon, junior studying M&T. Do a little bit of like personal MEV stuff, just like arbitrage, and been following this space for about the last year or so.
Nice.
Yeah, cool.
Good spot.
That's everyone. Anyway, I guess first question, just like, so we're on the same page, right? A lot of people say Skip is the Flashbots on Cosmos and things like that. I guess, like, how would you qualify this or I guess modify that statement when you're describing, what Skip does, etc.
Well, first of all, that's very kind. Flashbots is an incredible organization. I would say we were inspired by Flashbots when we started. We actually started at a Terra hacker house almost a year ago now, a little bit less than a year ago, actually. So this time last year, we were building Skip at a hacker house for Terra, and in about a month from now, Terra would collapse during that hacker house. And sort of we didn't really know exactly what to do, but one thing that we really did get out of the Terra hacker house was when we tried to build what essentially was a top of block atomic block space auction, there was a very clear pushback from the community that they were not interested in a Flashbots like solution, which looked more like Flashbots at the time in its V0. They were much more interested in solutions that expressed preferences over what kind of ordering was allowed in MEV market, particularly auctions that did not allow for some kinds of MEV that are considered more exploitative, like sandwiching and front running, right? So we natively built that into our auction. A lot of people ask, like, well, how do you prevent front running? How do you prevent sandwiching? Can't you Sybil that? Can't you attack that? You can actually prevent it very well via combination of two different things. One is if you have a single auction winner, which is also, I believe, how Flashbots started, you can just restrict the size of bundles to 2, where the signer of the bundle must be the second signer must be the signer of the second transaction in that bundle, which basically only allows for back running and not front running. And then you can extend it to multi-winners doing something that we call, well, I don't really know what to call it, but basically like KV store comparisons, where basically you don't allow bundles to touch the same state. And you can sort of have fresh state in between, because really what people are bidding on is not necessarily top of block in and of itself. They're bidding on the first access to touching certain states, right? So that might be, for example, the first transaction to touch a pool in Uniswap, right? Or the first transaction to touch particular liquidation in, Maker or Aave or something like that. But I would say since then, things have evolved substantially. We no longer have really any off-chain infrastructure. The stack that we are constructing inside of Cosmos does not involve off-chain builders. It involves fully on-chain MEV recapture. This is been working very well for us and for the communities and protocols that we've implemented it, including Osmosis with ProtoRev. And then more recently, we've been publishing and working on an implementation of an in-protocol builder that is generalized and does make use of searchers, but in a fully in-protocol way. I could go into more detail on that if it's interesting. And it just takes into account a couple things that I think are a little bit different in Cosmos versus Ethereum. One, we're in a world of app chains here. We're not in a world of a giant monolithic L1 with a ton of volume and activity, where the solution space is a little bit different. One is that Cosmos chains have much deeper preferences over how their blocks are built and over how their chain is constructed, even down to modifying consensus. And so to give chains a MEV toolkit that allows for that deep modification and exactly how blocks are built is important. And to do that, you have to sort of do that in protocol. And the second thing is there's not sort of on each individual chain, it's almost a little bit, it felt to us at least, to be a little bit wasteful or too overkill to have an entire PBS supply chain with builders, which are expensive to run with simulation, for it to be competitive and not result in basically a centralizing off-chain builder that would sort of dominate. So that's why we went with the on-chain route, and that's so far been good for us. So I'd say we started out very inspired by Flashbots. We've taken a much different fork in the road in terms of how the MEV solutions look, much more in protocol versus out of protocol. And then also, I think we have some different thoughts around where cross-chain MEV gets involved. And Cosmos, of course, because you have a bunch of different little app chains, cross-chain MEV is one of the main concerns, right? You don't think so much about single-chain MEV because it's all about cross-chain in Cosmos, right, with IBC.
Okay, anyone ask questions or how?
Yeah, so just want to step back a little. I was wondering, I saw that you started getting into the crypto space in general in 2016. And I was wondering what was your perception of MEV then, and how has it changed up until now? Since a lot of it has changed since then.
Yeah, well, in 2016, I don't think anyone was thinking about MEV. 2016, I was 18 years old, and I had taken a year out of high school to go work in Silicon Valley, where I met a couple of earlier Ethereum adopters, and I went to go work with a company that ended up becoming Cent, which was one of the first NFT marketplaces. They sold tweets as NFTs. They sold a Jack Dorsey tweet for a lot of money. I was the CTO there. And we were just more concerned about how to use Ethereum for micropayments. We weren't thinking about MEV whatsoever. I got more into MEV post sort of a brief stint in quantitative finance. I worked at Bridgewater for a little bit. And that really opened my eyes, also being at Penn and going to finance classes at Wharton. I learned a lot about some of the more advanced stuff that was happening. And once I saw the parallels in Ethereum, I got just really excited about the sort of basic primitives of MEV, namely atomic execution. I thought was really cool to start with. And then I think as most people who get involved, they try their hand at it. In our case, we did NFT MEV, which went very well for us, working as a little small shop. Just on the side for a couple of months, me and my co-founder Barry. And of course we got bored of it, and also got very competitive. And so eventually we're like, well, this makes a lot more sense to try to build something here.
And you mentioned how you were really inspired by Flashbots. Are there any similarities between their semi-recent Suave product to yours? And if so, what are some of the similarities and the main differences? And do you think they've like are they gonna be like any issues that they have that you guys are like kind of like approaching?
I mean, it's hard to say. Swav is a very ambitious project. As far as I understand it, it is supposed to be a intent and preference matching layer that interfaces with a variety of off-chain actors who both who mostly, I guess, execute on the intents, but the intents themselves are submitted by users on a highly available gossip network, huge throughput. Very interesting. So your question was, do we solve any of those problems? So I tend to think of like preferences and executors as a general framework for thinking about crypto transactions, right? So like when you create a preference, like today that looks like an unsigned transaction using some protocol, you're also specifying with your preference like the execution that you want for it, right? You're saying like, I want to trade X for Y, but I want to do it on Uniswap with this pool with this slippage, right? But I think like in the future, you're already starting to see the unbundling of preference from execution, right? You're starting to see people say, well, I want X for Y, and then you give it to a market maker or an RFC provider, and they're like, okay, well, who can match X for Y? And like, give me the best price for doing that, right? The best execution for doing that. I think like one of the interesting things is, even if Swav fully, I think, takes form in its current form, they're going to need executors in Cosmos, right? And that might be us, or it might be another MEV provider, it might be chains, or whatever it is. Like there'll be some kind of people who need to execute those preferences, right? And I think what we're focused on is, I think as Flashbots and some other players are, creating better tooling for executors to match more complex preferences. So far, a lot of the focus has been on, well, how do I, as an executor, which is usually a builder, like satisfy the block space preferences of individual searchers on individual chains? So, I want to execute this bundle atomically at the top of a block, right? They're like, builder will do that for you. But we're starting to think about, well, what does it mean to ask for cross-chain preferences? What does it mean to ask for, I want top of block here and top of block here, right? We're starting to build out some solutions for this in Cosmos. We haven't really looked at Ethereum yet. And we plan for that to be just another tool for executing those kinds of cross-chain preferences, which might sit on top of something like Swav or a different intent expression layer, right? It might be a NOMA or something similar. And I think you're starting to see a lot of that, right? So like shared sequencers, I think, are going to help with this. That's like a big narrative that just recently exploded. There's like Astria, which is a really great team, Espresso, which is a really great team on Eigenlayer. And there's many, many others to be announced that we've met. But I think those are going to attempt to execute some cross-chain preferences too. But in general, we're really focused on Cosmos. We're focused still on getting single chain MEV solutions out the door into protocols. Once we sort of have good adoption of that, I think we're going to start to focus on cross-chain preferences.
Yeah, I think I actually saw like it might have been like a tweet or blog post that you were like exploring or building tools on like cross-chain. Do you know like any timeline or like roadmap for that?
Yeah, I mean, we're still working through some stuff before we announce, but I think you can expect to hear from us on these things over the next 2 months.
Okay, yeah, sounds great.
One like thing that's been big for us is probably the most advanced protocol in terms of design that has come out in Cosmos for matching cross-chain block space preferences has been the interchain scheduler, which was posted about and written about in the Atom 2.0 white paper, which unfortunately did not pass, but was very exciting. And the author of that and one of the main protocol designers behind that has joined Skip, Sam Hart. And so we're revamping some things, working on some things, and I think we'll be announcing that shortly.
Okay. I guess one last question from me. I know like when you compare like Ethereum MEV and like Cosmos MEV, like I looked at like the satellite and I don't know, like
Sorry.
Yeah. That like extracted MEV from like Cosmos has it been like a lot of it, or maybe there just hasn't been like a lot of growth. So like I was wondering about like the revenue extracted from like through Skip, like how do you quantify it? How much is it? And then how do you compare it to ones on Ethereum? And how do you see like this changing in the future for like MEV extraction on Cosmos?
Yeah, it's smaller, right? It's a lot smaller. We knew that going in. We knew that there's activities that generate MEV and there's activities that don't, right? And the things that generate MEV are DeFi related for the most part, and most of it is swapping, right? Because swapping creates arbitrage. And the other things that generate MEV are, lending protocols, and unfortunately also, major hacks and things like that. You can't tell upfront how many hacks there are going to be, and also you don't want to index on that as a business source of revenue. But what we've seen is growth. Growth in terms of MEV recapture comes from a variety of sources. One is adoption of Skip. So that has gone very well. We've, on some chains, we build over 80% of the blocks. That is open for competition if people want to build their own builders that interface with MEV Tendermint, which is our version of Tendermint that allows for top of block building. And separately, the growth comes from, I'd say, like searcher adoption. We've seen growth from like 0 to 300-ish searchers over the last year or so, well, really 6 months. So that has gone both very well. Now the auctions are very competitive for basic arbitrage opportunities, similar to, I assume, builders in Flashbots or that use MEV Boost. You're seeing like 95 to 99% competition. And people are starting to expand out, as is the natural flow for searchers. And then separately, there's just been some more DeFi volume that has, boosted MEV rewards on a couple different chains. For example, one of the chains we're integrated with, Juno, launched 2 dexes, both of which have gotten some traction. And that created a lot of inter-dex arbitrage, as well as arbitrage on the dexes themselves. And then we finally launched our integration for Osmosis, which is one of the most active Cosmos chains for DeFi activity, with about $6 million of cyclic arbitrage MEV that we captured over the last year and a half. And now we're capturing 80 to 90% of that with ProtoRev. And so that's coming in at, over the past 3 weeks, it's been about $35K, $35,000 extracted. So, much smaller than Ethereum, that's for sure. But also the liquidity is fragmented over many different chains. You have to consider these things in aggregate. And then in terms of future growth, we are excited about a number of the different chains launching. It's hard not to be. Just to name a few: Barachain, Archway, Say, DYDX. Many of these are super exciting to us in terms of, they're all DeFi focused. Neutron as well, I forgot to mention, in Duality. They're all DeFi focused. I think they're going to generate, their own forms of MEV, and they're launching with MEV in mind, which is very exciting. Post Skip, we are able to sort of talk to these chains early and help craft their MEV stories and strategies with them, so that, on day one, they should have prevention and extraction, democratized extraction built in, which is like exciting for us.
During those conversations, was there like a consensus or like a common theme that they all had when you talking to these chains? Like any mitigation things or?
Nope. Chains approach it extremely differently. And that was like one of our findings early on, was that Cosmos chains feel very differently about MEV from chain to chain and from validator to validator. And we built our stack through and through to accommodate all of those preferences. Preferences around what kinds of extraction are allowed, preferences around where the MEV profit accrues, right? So in Ethereum, where does all that money go? It goes to the proposer. That's not the case in Cosmos. Using Skip, it can accrue anywhere. And also in terms of like what the solution looks like, right? So is it an on-chain solution? Is it an off-chain solution? There's a variety of preferences around that, but leaning in general towards on-chain solutions.
I have kind of a question, I guess that's more like zoomed in. So maybe, I mean, so I'm not super familiar with Tendermint and exactly how the consensus and such works, but you kind of mentioned that like stuff like front running and whatnot is like very difficult to do.
Yeah.
I guess what are the inherent differences between, I guess it would be in the mempool, right? Like what are the inherent differences between Cosmos's mempool and like Ethereum's mempool that prevents me from like inserting transactions afterwards? And I guess also as like a follow-up, like is there any sort of like slashing mechanism for people inside of Skip? Like if I attach a bundle later in the block than I should or something, like is there a way to prevent that? Yeah.
So two questions there. First one was, what's the difference between the Tendermint mempool and the Ethereum mempool? So at least pre and during Flashbots, Ethereum had priority gas auctions, which meant you could pay more gas to get your transaction mined sooner, right? Or higher up in the block. We don't have those in Cosmos. We have first come, first serve, or FIFO mempools, meaning you get mined the order in which you submit your transactions, right? And so natively, there was MEV going on, especially during Terra. There was a lot of MEV that was being extracted. And all of that took the form of latency races, right? So you didn't have the ability, or it was very difficult to insert your transaction above somebody else's to execute a sandwich, because how did you do that, right? There's no way of programmatically getting it above. So it was all sort of like a latency game. And the one thing you don't want for sandwiches is non-atomicity, right? It's very dangerous. So our plan was to not introduce that as a new primitive, right? And to keep it the way that it was in terms of not allowing for sandwiches and front running, but to just introduce a more competitive market around back running and arbitrage and liquidations. And then your second question was, forgetting your second question. What was it?
Yeah, so like basically it seems like the way the protocol works for, MEV Tendermint is I take bundles as a validator or as a proposer, and then, I stick them at the top of the block. What prevents me from not following that ordering, or like, is there anything?
As a validator?
Yeah.
Well, I guess as we've learned from Flashbots recently too, it's very hard to enforce these promises. We don't enforce this. We don't do blinded signing. The reason for that was there's a kind of a different vibe in Cosmos. I wouldn't call it a vibe, actually. I think it's actually very well constructed and intentional. But validators are very public facing in Cosmos. You know exactly who they are. They have cross-chain reputations. They're usually the same people across every single chain, right? Some of these chains have over 70% overlap, like Osmosis and Juno. And so we view that there was a very strong social consensus layer, which I think is the reason why no sandwiching is happening at Cosmos, even during times of very high liquidity like Terra. And B is also the reason why we're not super indexed on creating like very expensive or I would say like heavy modifications of Tendermint to enforce certain bundle ordering. So we do good faith. So we send over the bundles and we check afterwards and we make sure that they're mined and in the order that we send them. And if they're not, that would mean the validator modified their client to do that. And what we do is probably just stop serving bundles to them. But this has never happened over the last year of operation. I kind of think like the downside of doing it would just be too large, right? Like the downside of doing it would mean, some kind of major thread, and in Cosmos, tweet threads can wreck your validator if they're negative. And so, I don't think we haven't indexed super hard on that.
I see. Yeah. So I guess there's slashing, but it's social slashing, like in some sense.
Yeah. And there's also real slashing. Like there was a proposal that was put up by Sunny and Dev on Commonwealth a while ago that aimed to slash validators caught using toxic off-chain ordering mechanisms. And if they were caught doing that, if that proposal were to pass, then they would be slashed, like with stake. So, there are a variety of tools in the Cosmos toolkit, and we have very active governance around these things to sort of prevent a lot of like malicious behavior.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah, I guess it's like, I guess if you think about it, like, you know, ignoring social slashing and stuff, it's like, why isn't every validator doing MEV within the MEV ecosystem that they're acting in and stuff? So, but yeah, I think from like the social point of view, it's like, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Like if I get caught, like I'm never going to be able to make money ever again in some sense.
Yeah, probably the same reason why, you know, NASDAQ isn't front running users, right? Or sandwiching users, because like, you know, you'd make a lot of money doing that, billions of dollars, but you would also probably lose the reputation and trust one if you were caught, right? And I think validators are genuinely afraid of this.
Cool. Yeah, I guess that was it for me.
Anyone else? Sophia, Brandon?
I was curious if you could talk a little bit about the protocol own builders thing that I saw on your Twitter, and sort of I guess how you see it as improvement over the current technology.
Sure, yeah. So the current technology, which we call affectionately skip select, is a customizable top of block auction where validators will adopt MEV tenorment one by one, similar to how validators adopted MEV geth back in the day, one by one, and then gives them access or gives a builder access to building the top of that block. And then usually the top of that block is reserved for some kind of atomic backrunning bundle, right? And then we run an off-chain builder called the Sentinel that collects tens of thousands of bundles a day. You'd be surprised how many bundles we get on chains that have, you know, much less volume than Ethereum, but still some volume. And then we select the highest winner that also simulates as correct. We do like, you know, simulation-based payments and all that kind of stuff. And then send it on to the validator running MEV tenorment that is selected to be up next, since we have delegated proof of stake. Right. So we know ahead of time which validator is going to be up next, and then we can just send them the bundles. This could also work if it was like randomized proposers. You just send it to everybody, for example, or you have it be a pull-based model instead, or something like that. So that involved an off-chain builder, right? And it involved off-chain searchers submitting to that off-chain builder, who would simulate them, select the highest pair, who also simulated as correct, and then would send it on to the validator. POB cuts out the builder. So it moves the builder into the validator. So there's a number of questions that come out of that. Like, okay, well, what was the builder's role intent, like originally? Like what are you cutting out, right? So the first thing that builders do is they do simulation, right? So simulation can be expensive. And if you're building an entire block, it can be very expensive, especially in Ethereum, right? Like the amount of simulations and, you know, the amount of complexity you can get into when you're doing block building and bundle packing is quite large. So it cuts that part out and it moves the onus of that into the validator. What we found actually was validators were doing most of this work anyway, and the overhead of doing a couple extra simulations is minor. And also in the first version, they don't do any simulations. I think validators in the future can offer simulations as a service if they'd like to. But we imagine there's probably going to be off-chain simulators at some point that do this more as like a service, but ultimately the block building is still done by the validator. The second thing that that block builders do is they are in charge of like atomic bundling guarantees, right? So, you know, if you submit a transaction to the mempool and you submit another transaction, there's no guarantee that they're going to be right after each other or that they'll be executed together atomically. Bundlers or builders would do that, but we've actually built that functionality into the actual Cosmos SDK with POV. So there's a native bundling type that allows for you to bundle with another transaction directly afterwards, and it's processed by the application. It's like if you were to build bundling as a primitive into geth itself. That's like the level of like depth that primitive goes. And then there's also just a wide variety of sort of plug-in kinds of auctions and block building mechanisms that POB chains can use. So they can have Dutch auctions, they can have first price auctions, second price auctions, sealed bid auctions, because we're implementing threshold encryption around it. And then the last thing that POB does that's really special, and that's like a meaningful improvement over any kind of off-chain building solution, including PBS in our minds, is full censorship resistance. There's a concept in Cosmos SDK that is coming out called ABCI++, and they're introducing something called vote extensions, which means when a validator makes a proposal for the next block, everyone has to sign that, right? And say, okay, that's a valid proposal. Like, let's go forward with this one, right? But as part of signing that, they can pack in extra signed data in addition to their yes or no vote. So that signed data, in our case, is a bunch of bids that they've seen for the top of the block or a variety of places in the block. Therefore, the bids are censorship resistant. It's like a pigeonhole principle where basically you have to be censored by over 1/3 of the validators in order to not be included for the final proposal. So what this allows is for all of the validators to construct their own version of the block and to look at the proposal and say, huh, like you didn't include what I saw as the highest bid. Therefore, your proposal is invalid. So it prevents validators from doing things like bid censoring, right? So the common thing or like you would throw out the top bid and replace it with your own top bid, right, as the validator, and then you win the auction, you take all the money. You can't do that because the bids are now in consensus. So everyone else has seen the bids. So if you don't include the highest bid, then the other validators will say, you know, you're lying, essentially. That combined with threshold encryption allows you to have a credible auction. So basically, POB is on-chain credible auctions. By using those two primitives, you know, threshold encryption, native bundling types, and I guess the third one would be censorship resistance via vote extensions. That's a lot, but that's what POB is.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I definitely have to think about it a bit more to try to wrap my head around some of those things. So from a performance point of view, some other like non-Cosmos chains have thought about trying to separate what they call like sequencing or like the consensus layer from like execution as a way to improve performance. You sort of mentioned that you thought like simulating bundles wasn't a huge performance overhead. Just wondering what your thoughts on that sort of idea is, if you've looked into it at all.
People have thought about separating sequencing from execution.
Yeah, right. So it's just coming up with sort of like the order of transactions. Say when you've got like a network of nodes, and then having that operate as one layer, and then once sort of like the order of transactions has been determined, then to actually execute them and like update like the chain state. But it seems like you're doing them combined.
So this would be like the whole shared sequencer stuff, right?
Yeah, sort of on those, similarities.
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I think the customers we've talked to, the reason that they're building chains is because they wanted to combine sequencing with execution. Like there is an allure of building your own chain, right? And not being a roll up on top of a shared sequencer. Is one of the reasons we decided not to build one, at least in the short term, was because the customers we have, sequencing is an important part of their story, right? That's like the thesis that Skip was founded on, is that MEV and the way that you build blocks is an important preference of your chain, right? And to outsource that to a third party is a little bit scary as long as you can, but maybe not so much as long as you can ensure that that third party is adhering to your preferences, right? And so we've built a variety of solutions that enable for preference expression, and we've gone more towards the path of giving chains more authority over how their transactions are sequenced versus like less authority, which I view as like more the shared sequencer world where you give your sequencing rights to a different chain, right? I think there's also a little bit of a value alignment question or an incentive alignment question where I think rollups chains will view their sequencers as their business model, right? The way that they order transactions, collecting transaction fees, collecting MEV, like that is their business model. I think that's what they're selling, right? Chains are selling their block space. It's like they're good, right? And so to give up rights of that to another chain, I think is At least from some of the roll-ups we've talked to and some of the chains we've talked to, it's for a lot of them, it could be a scary proposition, or not desirable proposition. So, you know, I think there might be roll-ups that would look for that, especially ones that just, you know, want to get started really quickly and don't want to have to spin up a decentralized network of nodes to sequence. But that's less our customers.
That makes sense. One other question on a very unrelated note, sort of on like Ethereum and some other chains, like once like, you know, like bribes go up super high on like atomic arbitrage, people start shifting towards like non-atomic stuff, so like cross-chain or like between like centralized, decentralized exchanges. Do you have any thoughts on how like Skip might integrate with that, since it's definitely harder to detect?
So cross-domain arbitrage, I think, is generally a little bit oversold. I don't think there's a lot of cross-chain arbitrage. I think most of all of the cross-domain arbitrage is between dexes and sexes. I think a lot of people are arbing all of these dexes against usually Binance, right? Because that's where the deepest liquidity is, right? It's like, let's say you had a Whole Foods that was selling tomatoes and you had 2 farm stands that had like 20 tomatoes each, right? Like, you're not going to be what's like the true price of a tomato? It's not the one at the farm stands. It's going to be the one at Whole Foods, right? And so people are going to go back between the farm stands and Whole Foods to do that arbitrage, not between the farm stands. Does that make sense? So it's like more of a hub and spoke model. Excuse me. It's more of like a hub and spoke model. And that's what we're seeing the most, right? Is like these dexes are being arbed against Binance, which in this case is Whole Foods in terms of liquidity. And I think that extends out to Cosmos as well. I think in order to get to real like cross-chain arbitrage, we need to have like a bunch of Uniswaps that have a lot of liquidity themselves, and for there to be like viable price oracles that are not Binance. But I think in the short term, you see a lot of statistical arbitrage between like Binance and major centralized exchanges and decentralized exchanges. I think that's a huge part of MEV. I think for the most part, you can capture a lot of that via top of block auctions, right? So like the top of a block or the top of a certain state is extremely valuable because it is the first time after 6 seconds that you get to touch a known state, right? The known state being the end of the last executed block. Therefore, your arbitrage algorithms can collapse, right? So you like know the state on 2 places so you can execute, right? So I generally think, you know, by having top of block auctions, you can capture a meaningful amount of Sexadex ARB, because, you know, they're paying whatever price they're paying on, let's say, Binance for execution, but in order to complete that arbitrage and close it, they're going to need to pay in the auction to get that top of block slot, and they theoretically be willing to pay the entire amount of the arbitrage, maybe minus some statistical risk adjustment.
Cool.
Basically,
yeah, that makes
top
sense.
of block auctions are great. Like, do a lot of
Nice.
things.
Yeah.
Kind of related, we chatted with someone that does a lot of high frequency trading and runs like an MEV firm, I guess. And you know, I guess we also talked to a VC guy, and he said that he thinks MEV will go to 0. And we asked, you know, the founder, and the founder's like, yeah, MEV is just going to get really more and more competitive, and you're really only going to be able to see like a few firms that will be able to compete, especially on like simple ARB transactions. I guess in a world where like maybe this number of searchers decreases dramatically, does that change how you guys design any of your auctions or things like that?
No, I'd say like searchers tend to have a consolidating effect. It's very similar to high frequency trading, right? So like my co-founder used to work at DE Shaw. I used to work at Bridgewater. Bridgewater is a high frequency trading firm, but DE Shaw is. You tend to see a lot of consolidation in the high frequency trading firms in traditional finance, right? So you have little shops that might pop up for a second. They have a second in their son, and then they get acquired, right? And what we've seen over, like, there used to be a lot more of these shops, and they all sort of have conglomerated, and they all just viciously compete against each other. And it makes sense, I think, when you get into the industry, because you understand that it's just so intensely competitive, right? Like, to eke out any kind of alpha requires a tremendous amount of investment in infrastructure and knowledge. And so, the people at these firms spend their whole lives trying to find these tiny little microsecond advantages over each other. And it's just that's a huge moat, right, for new people to become involved in. So I think you might see that eventually. I think because we have good market dynamics around atomic arbitrage and atomic MEV, those things will be competed up to 100%. But then when it comes to statistical things, right, which is like in HFT land where this is all gone already, you'll probably see, a couple firms really dominate, is my sense.
Okay, cool. Any other questions, guys, or are we good?
I maybe want to jump in with a few like higher level logistical questions. I think Nathaniel, David, Brandon, you covered a lot of the technical ones. The first one, so when it comes to integrating with a few of the app chains or applications, I think I see like the more recent one of Injective, and then prior to that with Osmosis and the Proto Dev. Do you do all of this on a case by case basis as like a team for these integrations? Is that scalable, or how do you handle that internally?
Yeah. So far we've had 2 launched products. One is the Skip Select off-chain top-of-block auction. Looks a lot like Flashbot's V0 with MEV.
Right.
And then we have ProtoRev. So ProtoRev was a specific osmosis integration. That was like the subject of a lot of co-research into the on-chain block building space. It's the first really ever in protocol on-chain MEV recapture mechanism. I don't know of any others. It'd be like if you built backrunning into like Geth, right, itself. And that was mostly an experiment with osmosis that ended up being very successful. And so for the most part, all other chains we've sold on Skip Select, right? Like, that's the product that they've been interested in. It's generalized. And so the integration there is very, there are some custom elements, but for the most part, it is generalizable to any Cosmos-based chain that uses Tendermint. In the future, we plan on generalizing the in-protocol approach with POB, which will be available and also customizable by any chain, but won't require too much overhead from Skip in terms of managing different deployments. And part of the reason for that is that POB doesn't involve any kind of off-chain actors, right? So we don't have to maintain these very bulky builders. So I would argue that it has been scalable.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting. So I think we'll take a look at ProtoRev. The other thing, maybe a related question, because I think you brought up governance a little bit earlier. We do a lot of governance ourselves, but mostly on Ethereum-based DeFi protocols and like associated things, not so much in Osmosis, or not Osmosis, in Cosmos. But I'm just curious how your team works with governance. I see proposals related to Astroport, related to Osmosis, like ProtoRev. I'm just curious, like, how that drives where you move or strategize for Skip.
Yeah, I mean, governance is, like, when you're in crypto, right? When you work with chains as your customers, I suppose, and your partners, there's a variety of stakeholders. There's the chain founders or the dev shop behind the chain. There's the validators, and then, there's the stakers. And most of the major integrations that we do, we tend to go through governance for those, right? Because, that's something that the communities should have a say on, right? For example, if they adopt an MEV solution, and to make sure that they are happy with the parameters that it has. And so we try to be very transparent. We don't, we've gone through governance on many of the chains that we've launched on. And then sometimes we won't go through governance if it's just a validator by validator adoption. And then if we want a wider deployment or the chain is asking for one, then we will go through governance. This happened on Juno recently. well, we didn't go through governance, the community did. But yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, it's kind of like B2B, agreements, except in crypto.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense. I think so. Penn has a pretty established governance program now. And I wonder if after we kind of come more acquainted with Skip and also the work, just like with POB, I think we'd maybe speak in contributing to some of the forums at the very least. And just like just thoughts, but this is very helpful to us.
Yeah, sure. That'd be great.
Yeah, I think those are my only questions, Eric.
Would love if you guys, on that note, like if you ever want to post on ideas.skip.money where we sort of lay out all of our
Yeah.
research topics, we love that. We'd be happy to engage.
Yeah, that forum looks great. I think we definitely have to take a deeper look into that too.
One sort of more philosophical question is, who do you think MEV should accumulate to between like, the users, validators, searchers, or like the protocol in like an ideal world?
I don't know. I never have known. That's the answer. Like, there's an argument for all, right? So like if you think about the most basic like arbitrage, right? Like a top of block back run, right? The bread and butter of most MEV protocols. Then there's the user who's creating the state transition that you're back running, but it's not a sandwich, so it's not like you're taking the money out from them. There's all the other users who created that state like before, right, via their state transitions with their own swaps. Then there's the validators that are validating the chain via replicated computation to make sure that actually gets mined into eternity. There's the wallet that facilitated that transaction. And then there's the searcher who actually found the opportunity and then maybe used their own or someone else's capital to execute it. It is not clear to me that any one of them in that case is worth more than another strictly, or worth all in that case. We've had this conversation many times where we've built top of block auctions on certain chains, and then protocols expressed interest in building their own MEV recapture on that chain, right? So like that smart contract, let's say Uniswap, right, or in our case Astroport, for example, wanted to recapture their own MEV, and we're helping them do that. But also there's MEV that's going back to the validators via the top of block auction. We realize is you have to win both auctions, right? You have to win the order flow auction to get the order to back run. Then you also have to win the top of block to get the state that you want to execute against. And so you need to pay for both. So there's some kind of market there, right? There's like competing market forces. Like, well, we're the block space. You need the block space to get your order in, but this is also the order that you want to back run, which you need to get your back run. So it's like you need to buy both, right? And so there's a conflict there, right? Or there's a good marketplace between them.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think it's tricky.
Yeah. We try to not take sides. We try to build primitives that allow for this expression, and for it to happen at least in a transparent way and in a way that can interface with each other well. Because ultimately, there's a variety of methods that you might want to go around this. Like a protocol might say, hey, we promise to give all of our MEV back to the chain, and maybe the chain then gives them a grant to deploy, right? Or helps incentivize the liquidity on their pools if they're a DEX. Or maybe the protocol says, well, we want all of our MEV, right? And we'll send it back to the user, and they try to use that to bootstrap their users, right? Or drawn to the fact they're going to get back all of their MEV. So, there's a variety of ways people might want to approach this. And I think the best thing to do is at least give them the tools to do so.